Welcome everybody to our monthly didactic. Great to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Walt Stadler, who I was thinking how long I've known Walt, and I'm pretty sure we met in 1995 when I went to the University of Chicago as an intern. So it's our 30th year anniversary of knowing each other. And I asked Walt to speak at this series. I think this would be a little bit different than some of our other lectures. I mean, Walt's obviously been around for a long time. I can say that because I've been around a long time. And so I asked him to just give us, more career perspective and big picture and lessons learned. And he's been an editor of journals and understanding tricks to get manuscripts in and responses, which obviously all of us deal with, and grants and basically anything sort of, lessons learned from a lot of time being in this business and politics or anything else you want to share. While we're all ears and appreciate you taking your time today.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. And we're going to make this, I'm going to give I really have like a handful of introductory slides, and then I think we can make this much more of a forum of a conversation and a discussion. And I set some things up here. So as Brian said, I've done a lot of different work with a lot of different people. So these are my disclosures here. So just to give some context of where we were, this was 1994 when Brian was an intern. The guy in the upper right corner is Nick Vogelsang, who was, one of my primary mentors, who's unfortunately passed away as a complication of treatment from his Hodgkin's lymphoma as a resident. Below is what I looked like 30 years ago or so, and one of us still looks good, the other maybe not so good. But fortunately, we are still married. Just in GU cancers in general, when I started, we really, prostate cancer, we had hormone sensitive versus hormone refractory. We had LHRH agonists were the major advance. And the medical oncologist was generally considered the bone pain doctor for prostate cancer. Renal cancer was still sometimes even called hypernephroma, was considered one disease. There were very few academic oncologists, and the only thing we gave was high-dose IL-2 and interferon, and we probably killed as many patients as we saved in the process. And in bladder cancer, we had chemotherapy with MVAC that was invented in the 1980s, but that's it. So I sometimes say that one of the reasons I went into GU oncology is that I didn't have to know very much, and there's a lot of opportunity to make a difference, obviously. But to be honest, the big thing of it was my relationship with Nick, and Nick as a mentor, and I think we should talk about that a little bit today. So this is nothing new to you guys, right? We went from one disease to a dozen different diseases, and even this classification is probably incomplete. No need to rehash that here. But just to say that it's gotten a lot more complicated, and although these different diseases are obviously related, and have some commonality, they also are in many ways very distinct, and that is in and of itself an opportunity as far as I see it. I think that the other question that's come up a lot, and that I've paid a lot more attention to is, as we increasingly manage this disease and others like it as a chronic disease, a chronic serious disease, some of these things that we considered as doctors maybe not so important become very important. So frequent visits for infusions are burdensome and difficult. We label toxicities as grade 1 and 2, but they are extremely burdensome. Grade 2 diarrhea is something like, 8 to 10 stools a day or 6 day, whatever it is. I keep forgetting. If you're doing that every day for, months and months at a time, that's a major impact. And this is especially if there's limited family caregivers and limited health literacy. Small copays, especially for our underserved populations, have major financial toxicities. And providers for underserved communities are really overburdened. We have our safety net hospitals in neighborhoods where they're working their tails off, and they don't have a lot of support to provide the care. And so I think one of this really gets into the issue of how we provide world-class care, high specialty care, to a larger number of individuals is becoming an increasingly challenging problem. So when I talk to, once again, this is something that you here all know, but this is what I tell others when I give sort of an overview of renal cancer. It's a little bit mom and pop for those who are experts, but it is sort of reflects the change that's occurred in the care of this disease from when I started. So I think when I think about this disease and I think about where do we need to go, what do we need to do, here's some of sort of the big picture things that I think about, and you can think of others as well. But will novel immunotherapy combinations actually be helpful? There's lots of ideas, but will they actually pan out? Where are we supposed to be incorporating the HIF inhibitors? They have modest benefit by themselves, and we need to think about what we're doing. We need to think about molecular predictive markers, including what's different about poor and intermediate prognosis, which clinically we know behaves differently, but the molecular markers, and Brian and others have done some things along those lines. I mentioned earlier the relationship between clear and quote non-clear cancers. They're all related, but they're different. How do we best target these chromatin modifying alterations? We know that there's a lot of chromatin modifying gene alterations in kidney cancer, but we really don't target them at this day and age. So can we, should we? We know this is a disease with lots of metabolic alterations. Can we use that as a target? I've always had some skepticism because the metabolic pathways are by definition adaptable, and I wonder whether that's something we can do, but maybe we can. Everybody knows that BiTEs, ADCs, and cellular therapy are emerging, and I think, as I mentioned before, decreasing treatment burden and cost are critical questions in this day and age. So, that's sort of, making sure that we all level set. But this is really sort of my last slide, and I want to take this, go from here a little bit and begin to think about each one of these topics and maybe have a little bit more of a conversation, because I think everyone here is sort of saying, okay, I love this, I want to do this, I want to make an impact in this field, but how the hell do I do it, right? What do I make and do it? And so I put mentor and mentors as number, one on the list. None of us have gotten where we are without good mentors. And to me, mentorship and mentors, it's a little bit of a mutual admiration society, right? Mentors have to sort of believe that you are the best thing since sliced bread, and not only are you great, you're going to help them advance in the field and help them conduct some of the work they're interested in. And the best way they can do that is to promote you. But you also think that they're great and wonderful and are paying attention to you and paying attention to your professional growth. And as long as there's this mutual admiration, then it works. The minute it becomes a more transactional relationship, you do A, then I do B, then there's a tendency for these relationships to break down. The second thing I would say...
Hey, Walt, do you want to stop on pause,
yeah,
maybe on these? Might be good just to get some input.
And let me say one more thing, and then
Sure.
I was going to pause. And the other thing I was going to say about mentors is I put S in there because almost all of us over the years have worked not with one mentor, but with multiple different mentors that may provide different components of our sort of professional development and professional guidance. So I was going to stop there and sort of start open it up to questions, concerns, thoughts, comments.
So I was going to say, let's take this topic of mentorship, which is obviously kind of what this whole academy is about, is to provide, other rings of mentorship that maybe you're not getting in your own institution, or to complement those, I should say. But I have some questions and comments, but I'll let others go first if people have questions or comments about mentorship, because people on this call probably serve both roles. I was going to say, if you could say like the attributes of a good mentee, since I think, again, most of the academy members are more on the mentee side. Those green flags that I think one thing, just to back up, I think one thing that is unrealized, that mentorship takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of time, and there's only so much time in the day that you can allocate. And so, if there are green flags and it's mutual admiration, as Walt said, then you're going to put a lot more effort into it. And if it's not, then I think the natural tendency is to not do that. And so I guess the question for you, Walt, on the mentor side is, what are the green flags that you say, man, this person is really into it. They're going to benefit the most from my mentorship, and I'm willing to put effort into it. Like, what makes you put effort into it aside from just your desire to do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite simply interest and enthusiasm, right? And I'll use you, Brian, as an example. I think you came to me when you were in, I don't know whether you were, I think you were a resident at the time at U of C, and you said, I want to do something. And I said, yeah, I had one of my 27 negative phase 2 trials, and so I basically gave Brian the big, we didn't have computer. I just basically gave him a big fat folder of all the patients, the data, and I said, go analyze it, and go do something, and come back with it, and we'll see if we can write a paper. And Brian came back a week later and had it all organized, had tables, had a draft of a paper, and basically I said, well, this guy wants to do some things. He's really enthusiastic. He really is. And so now I'm going to spend some time to make sure that what we put together is a good piece of work. The opposite, obviously, is, you give someone something and they sort of say, well, maybe I'll do it, maybe next week, and you tell them come back to you in 3 weeks. They come back in 6 weeks and say, well, I took a look at it, I'm thinking about it, and maybe I'll do something like. I mean, those people, I'm going to say, forget about it. I got enough headaches, right? I mean, that to me is in many ways number one.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't know if people have questions or comments on that, but I think, just pardon the expression, getting shit done, right? I mean, and sometimes you can only take it so far, and you gotta be like, listen, I don't know what I'm doing. I need help. I gotta, or I had this thing happen. I need to push the timeline back. And that happens, to a limited extent, but it's, to me, that's like, I totally agree. Well, that's like the first branch point. Is this person actually going to get work done? Are they actually going to take this over and actually do something? Or is this just like, well, I'm kind of interested in GU, but I might be interested in melanoma. And, they're still sort of in that speed dating phase.
Right.
Comments from others, kind of, or questions? Seeing a lot of screens. Anything else from the mentorship side? And it could be on either side. I mean, when I talk about this, it's like, what do I look for in a mentor? Right. I mean, because then, again, mentorship takes a lot of time. You either have the gene or you don't, I think, right? Either you like to do it or you don't. But maybe, Walt, you can comment on if you're looking for a mentor, especially outside your institution. I think that's much trickier, right? When you can't just go down the hall and corner somebody. What to look for in terms of, I mean, Nick Vogelsang was both of our mentors,
Right.
Probably the most shining example, certainly for me. And so what should people look for when they're choosing a mentor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily the most famous or the one person with the biggest name. It's a person that demonstrates this in the same way, interest in you, and it demonstrates interest in what you are doing. Okay. I think that the other part of this is seeking out mentors that are relevant to to the work that you're doing at that time, right? If you're working on HIF, seek out a mentor that knows something about HIF and can help you, and where at the end of the day you think you might have, a collaborative relationship. I've done a lot of administrative work in my life, and when I jumped into some of these positions, I called up friends, who were also administrators, and said, "Hey, give me some advice." Classic. I remember the example is, I don't know if anyone knows John DiPerzio, who was for a long time head of hematology oncology down in St. Louis at Washington University, and he's a heme malignancy guy, but had a big heme-onc department, and I was head of heme-onc, but also had hematologic malignancies. And for a long time when I was there, most of my heme colleagues thought I was an idiot. I'm a dumb prostate cancer doc. What the hell do I know about leukemia? Which is correct. But then when I had to make some decisions, they basically said, "Well, you're just an idiot. You're just a dumb prostate cancer doc. You don't know what you're talking about." So, literally I called John and said, "John, here's what I want to do. Doesn't matter what the issue was. Does this make sense?" He says, "Well, of course that makes sense. That's what we're doing with our heme malignancies." I said, "Well, good. I needed that sort of feedback because they all think that I'm an idiot." And he says, "Oh, no, don't worry about it. All my solid tumor docs think that I'm an idiot." So I'm like, okay, fine, at least. But in terms of mentorship, it's people who understand what you're doing, understand what you're going through, and can provide some guidance in the specific area that you're seeking at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's track record of mentoring. Somebody's 20 years in, they don't suddenly become a good mentor. It's again, you sort of got the gene or you don't. And especially for this group, which is, a bit more lab based, at least for the AKCI folks, and if you're more clinical, the opposite, like having a clinical person, having a lab person, like not just have one person who does exactly what you do, but a diversity of experience and ages. And people love being on a mentorship committee, right? Like people love to think that they're smart and mentoring the next generation, right? And so it's don't be afraid to ask for help, from lots of people, because you can benefit in a lot of ways from different perspectives.
Yeah, and that I think, Brian, is, when we talk about having more than one person, that's really part of, what I think you need to do. Seek out people that can help you in multiple different manner. You might have someone that you need to reach out to for, how do I, professional advice, how do I develop my career, others that might provide more advice on the laboratory aspects of what you're doing, and others that might sort of give better advice on how do I integrate my laboratory interests with clinical interests and so forth. So it is often not just one person.
Two quick comments, and then we'll move on to your second bullet point is, unlike I think when Walt and I were going through it, there are now more national mentoring, right? Like just AKCI and KCA, like there's certainly more of a national focus on it and funds toward it. That didn't exist. And it was pretty much in your own institution, right? And you either were lucky to have people or not. So I think that's a plus. And the other thing I would get advice about that I probably didn't do early enough is there's a lot of politics and a lot of relationship building in this game. We might get down to that on some of the other bullet points, but way more than I ever appreciated. And I thought, well, if you just, work the hardest and are the smartest, you'll be successful. And that's not always true. So that's where you can really lean on, people with gray hair like Walt and myself to relationship and politics and stuff. I wish it weren't that way, but it absolutely is part of success in this.
I think that's correct, Brian. And what the way I put it is, we're social animals, right? The advantage of having, Teams and Zoom and everything else is, as you said, you can now collaborate, have mentorship relationship with essentially anyone in the world, right? It's a click of the button, they're there. But since we are social animals, it's very hard to make that work unless you actually meet the people. There's something human about us where we have to shake each other's hands, look them in the eye in order to trust them. And at that point, all this Zoom stuff works. But until you've done that, some of the Zoom stuff just doesn't, just doesn't click well. And so I often tell our, fellows that, the most important part of any meeting you go to is the bar afterwards. And you don't even have to drink alcohol. You can drink ginger ale. It doesn't matter what. But seeing the people there, getting together, having those social interaction, then cements all the other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, I lied. One last comment. So when Walt and I started working together, I didn't even have a cell phone, right? So it was only human interaction. There was no virtual or anything. So, all right, let's, in the interest of time, let's move on.
So ideas. I mean, the other thing I thought about is, right, we're always talking about ideas. How to, if you want to do some research and do something original, how do you have something original? It's actually not that hard, right? I mean, one is, some of it comes from the mentors. That's their job. I tell folks that, when Nick was my mentor, one of the reasons I loved working with him is he was one of these guys that had, 6 ideas every minute. And most of them were, to be honest, pretty bad. But he had so many more ideas than any of the rest of us. All I had to do was sit in his office for a half hour and pick out the 1 or 2 things that, I thought were, hey, that's pretty smart. We can work on that, and then make it happen. I didn't have to think very hard, right? But in addition to your mentors, I think most of the people here have some kind of clinical interactions. And it's those clinical experiences that really raise the questions. And I put some of the questions down here at the end, but you're seeing the patients, right? We're not curing kidney cancer patients, right? And so the challenges that you see when you see patients, that's the food and the fodder, for the ideas in terms of sort of research. Now, there is an important difference in terms of how clinicians and how researchers think, and I had to learn this for a while, right? Clinicians think about what's going to help this patient, but a researcher oftentimes has to say, here is my hypothesis, and I'm now going to do an experiment that is going to either help me support or disprove that hypothesis. And a good experiment, and I don't care if it's a clinical experiment or a laboratory experiment, a good experiment gives you data and information in both directions, right? It gives you information about your hypothesis if it turns out the way you think, if it's, quote, successful, but it also gives you information if it turns out to work in a different manner. So I think we have to sometimes, as clinicians, think a little bit different and think much more like a scientist. And then we can talk about how to sell, but essence, we have to fund our research, right? In academia, we have the privilege of pursuing the ideas that we think are important, but we have the obligation to figure out how to pay for it. So maybe I'll stop there a minute and see if people have some questions or comments before I go on.
Right, let's get some participation from the audience.
So I'll chime in on a couple of different ideas over here. So one is that I think when you're on the mentor side, right, it's easy to gravitate towards looking for folks who have similar traits or personality types as yourself. That's a problematic hole to go down, and it creates a self-fulfilling sort of a group of people who essentially just only seem to agree with each other.
Right.
And on occasion, if they disagree, then it becomes a really problematic thing for them to overcome those disagreements. And so I think a critical part really for me is having opinion, but at the same time also being able to listen and be able to be adaptable. In the power differential, if it is normalized to some extent, can allow for a more fruitful long-term relationship. It's just my general experience. The second thing I think in terms of ideas as well, there are 2 things that I think are critical. One is there are too many ideas out there. and there is not enough time to pursue all of them. So yes, it's true. It's easy to get ideas, but it's also really critical to be self-aware of your own limitations and not start chasing every idea that is out there. And ask yourself what really is your core skill set. What can you do better than anybody else, which will allow you to answer this question in a timely manner and in a manner that is so rigorous that very few others will be able to attempt this problem. That's, I think, where the sweet spot of success for me lies. You'll not succeed in all in accomplishing all those goals. Not all of them will become big things in the long run, but I feel among them there probably might be a seed that really will grow into something really critical. So that's just generally how at least I have to temper my own excitement about new things in this way, because I feel myself constantly reading and thinking about, wow, that would be really cool if we can chase this down and that down, and then I get
Well,
hit with
yeah,
like 24 hours in a day.
right. Abhishek. I think that the key here is to find the balance of focus on what you think is important that you can accomplish, but also the flexibility to pursue unexpected findings, right? Sometimes I say you have to have enough balls in the air to essentially give you the odds that something will be successful, but you can't have so many balls in the air that you drop all of them, right? And so that is there's no easy answer to that, but going either direction too far is, can lead to challenges. So.
And I would just add relevant to bullet point number one. I mean, good mentees will come with ideas, right? Not just walk in your office and say, hey, tell me what to do, or, I'm not really sure. I mean, and that takes work, right? I don't think I necessarily did that well early on, but even if as Walt says, like, they're not all going to be great ideas or make sense, but it's just the effort that, yeah, I've thought about this. Here are 3 or 4 things I'd like to pursue. And then the mentor's job is to say, well, here's how to prioritize, or these 2 are good and these 2 aren't. So.
Agree.
All right. You want to go on to pharma?
Yeah, so this is related to, whatever idea you have to sell it, right? You have to get grants, you have to get funding, and there's only a handful of places, to get funding. There's, the NCI, there's other large organizations like ASCO, AACR, there are patient organizations, like KCA, and then, there's pharma, at least in our business. I put pharma there. So before I go to that, I think what's important is, regardless of who funds it, it's important to try to sell the idea and not necessarily the specific drug, which is related to the pharma combination. And it's important to recognize that most funding agencies, any of those that I have listed, if they fund at best at the 10 to 20th percentile, and like the NCI, more like the 8th or 9th percentile. And I can tell you that sitting on various committees and review committees can probably cut out the bottom half of the applications. They might be able to agree on the 1 or 2 applications that are so brilliant that they need to be funded. And everything else is a crapshoot. I have never been on a single grant review committee where I believe that the committee could reliably distinguish between a grant that's at the 20th or 22nd percentile and one that's at the 9th percentile or 10th percentile. That is dumb luck on the part who you get as a reviewer, everything else. And what that means on a pragmatic basis is that you just sometimes need to submit the same basic idea over and over again. It's shots on goal, and each time you do it, it gets a little bit better. You learn how to communicate your ideas a little bit better, but it is shots on goal. So you're not going to be successful. You often can't predict the success because it is in some ways a random event. pharma is one of the funding sources, but when you go to pharma, you also have to understand that the reason they fund something, whether that be a clinical trial or whether they, help fund something in the laboratory, it's all about their self-interest, right? I mean, they're going to give you money because they think that your work is going to end up benefiting them in the entrepreneurial capitalistic world. It's going to allow them to sell more drug. It's allow them to get a drug approved for a different indication. It's going to allow them to get a drug, into clinical trials. That's what they're interested in. And it's all about it's all about whether your work is more likely to contribute to their bottom line or put their bottom line at risk. Now, that's the nature of the business. That's not a value judgment, but let's face it, if you want to do a trial of, drug A versus drug B from two different pharma companies, neither one, and you think they're all about the same, you're probably not going to get that funded from either company, right? Because, if you're looking at like toxicity outcomes, they can probably only lose, right? And so they're not going to fund something like that. So just recognize what the business environment is. The other important part of the pharma relationship, and the reason I put that there, is that those of you who are clinicians, like I was and Brian, and do a lot of clinical trials, pharma asks us to do clinical trials. It's important to recognize that this is contract work. It is completely and totally contract work. Now, sometimes we advise them a little bit, sometimes we give them a little bit of guidance, but for the most part, we have to recognize it's a bit of a game. Right? And the game is pretty simple, which is that we become key opinion leaders. We help move something along in the company. We become, in essence, their good housekeeping stamp of approval. And then in turn, they let us up on the podium to speak and let us put it on their CV so that our deans can weigh the CV. It's not your original work, right? I mean, let's face it. When the company makes the drug, the company writes the trial, the company collects the data, the company analyzes the data, and then the company puts, Brian on the podium at ASCO. It's not necessarily because he gave them this wonderful advice at the beginning of the trial.
What?
So that's fine. But just remember that it's your original research that makes, that is truly the difference. And the other reason that's important, right? And it is an important component besides being snarky about it, which is that we have an important role. And the important role as investigators on these trials is to protect the patients. That's our job. We got to protect the patients. And number two, we have to take our role of, quality control seriously. And, Brian and I have both been on trials where the company sort of says, great, this was an amazing drug, it was well tolerated, and we have an improvement in progression-free survival. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it's our job to say, your improvement in progression-free survival was 2 months, which is 1 CT scan, and everybody on the drug was miserable. All right, so it is our job to help, make sure that, what's presented in the, in the public and in the scientific literature is honest and interpreted appropriately. So those are our two roles, and that is an important role when we work with, at least with sponsored trials per se.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Walt, I mean, I think good advice for young people is, and Walt does this maybe better than anyone I've ever met, is it's okay to be honest with industry and tell them what you really think. There's certainly a tactful way to do that, but I think when you go and tell one group of people one thing and then you switch to another meeting room and tell another group of people another thing, Well, it just doesn't look good. It's not a good long-term strategy. Or if you're, you go on Twitter and tell people your results, be they lab or translational or clinical, are the best thing since sliced bread, and this is amazing. And then, you know, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So it's okay to be honest and sober about results. And in the long run, I think it'll get you more respect than just telling everybody that they have the greatest drug so that they'll give you money or make you PI of the trial. It's really hard to do, right? It's really tempting to not do that. I've certainly not always done it perfectly, but I think in the long run, that's a better strategy. I think you get more respect that people, when you say something, people know that you mean it and you're not just saying it to please somebody.
And I can't overemphasize that part enough, right? You know, oncology, it's like a small village. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, right? If you're the kind of person who will say something good anytime someone's nice to you, people will know that. If they know that you're going to be honest and critical about the results, including your own results, people will know that as well.
Yeah. It's better to under promise, over deliver. It's better to present results and be very humble about them and almost understate them and let other people promote them for you. That's a far better strategy. We have about 20 minutes left. I was going to ask the group, we probably won't get through all this. If there's other, these sort of big picture career topics, either on the list or not on the list, that you might prioritize. Promotion, maybe. What? Somebody shout out some ideas.
Can I ask a question on that previous point?
Yeah, sure.
If nobody has anything else to do that. So Bill would always say, one of his favorite phrases was that a bad way to do science is to throw spaghetti on the wall and to see what sticks. It essentially says that you have no clue why something is working. There's no rational design. And this is, I feel, a trap that you can fall into in any kind of clinical trial design, right? So if you're designing trials based on what will be tolerated or what is working in some other disease indication, you often move away from the rational basis for why to target something in what you are studying biologically. Even in the best instances where you're using rational design, I mean, the HIF example is the best in probably RCC. Even in that instance, we oftentimes don't succeed very well. So if you even take that reason away, now it becomes a big problem, and then it's a hit or miss. It's a 50-50 shot on whether something will or will not give you a benefit at the end. So I'm bringing this up is because we had the chromatin modifiers and the metabolic targets as examples of future direction in which we might go to. And I think in terms of the metabolic targets, I think the water has gotten so muddied because of the Calithera trial, frankly, that it has become challenging to even go down that direction for many possible metabolic targets. That trial, in my mind, had no rational basis to combine it with cabozantinib, for example. So when you're designing a trial, and I would like to hear the clinical perspective over here, what is the level of pressure that you feel in terms of what combinations would you try? Already the patients are going to come heavily pre-treated with other approaches before they even try your experimental drug. So the deck is already stacked against you. But in the face of that, how much power do you have to fight back and say that this does not make any rational sense for me to try? Let me address this in a more reasonable way with this cohort or these are the built-in parameters here.
So there's two aspects to that. One is sponsors will come to you sometimes with some really dumb ideas. And it's perfectly fine to say, I think this is really dumb. Good luck. I'm not going to participate in this clinical trial. Lately, when I've done that, they put me on the data safety monitoring committees. So,
Totally.
So I win anyway. So that's one thing. In terms of your own ideas, right? I think you're absolutely correct. There has to be some logical mechanism. There has to be some logical reason that you want to test something, and you have to have, especially sort of for clinical trials, have to have a hypothesis that you're trying to test. And, I do think there's a role for, discovery science and, expression profiling, et cetera. But when it's a clinical trial, it really needs to be a hypothesis. Now, there may be the need to modify some of the pragmatic aspects based on ethics, right? I can't give untreated patients some kind of drug that has no known efficacy when I have known effective therapies. I may not be able to combine it, I may be able to combine it with a VEGFR inhibitor, but, I have to choose which one. It doesn't really matter which one. So there are these pragmatic aspects. But I agree with you, Abhishek. We should not do trials based only on the pragmatic aspects, because if we forget the fundamental hypothesis, it becomes even less likely that something is going to, work, and our odds are stacked against us from the beginning.
Yeah, I just jump in. I agree. I mean, I think there is a very pragmatic and empiric overlay of every clinical trial, right? There's just things, as Walt says, we can and can't do. And even if the mechanistic rationale is maybe not the best, sometimes it's just the way the trial has to come together. Having said that, I mean, there's plenty of trials, probably name 10 off the top of my head, where you're like, this makes absolutely no sense. Like, it is completely commercial. It's a commercial question, not a scientific question, and those generally tend not to end well. So, I mean, there's been plenty of trials that I've turned down because I just think it's going to fail. I mean, we can't do everything. Just like you said, Abhishek, you can't pursue every experiment in your lab, and you're making a bet, right? You're trying to bet on the winners. What ideas are going to pan out? What trials are going to be positive and help patients, right? And so it's some educated guesswork, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But there's definitely a practical overlay that sometimes you can't escape. Questions on that, or any other
topics?
Other topics? I kind of like the rejection and failure one.
So, rejection and failure, right? As someone told me earlier in my career, we call it research and not search. The vast majority of things that we try don't go anywhere, right? And that's sort of the nature of the business. That's okay. But that also gets to, how do you write a grant? How do you write a trial? So I think that when you design your research, whether it's a laboratory experiment or a human experiment, you want that experiment to tell you something about the hypothesis, regardless of how the experiment turns out. And the big difference between a human experiment and something in the lab is that it's real people with real lives, and the experiment takes multiple years, right? I mean, if I screw something up in a lab dish, I'm going to say, oh, crap, I'm going to come back next week and repeat it. If I screw it up in a clinical trial, you come back 5 years later and have to repeat it, right? And that's just not feasible. The challenge a lot of times with the clinical trials, and with all researchers, we believe in our hypothesis, so we design experiments that will help us if they turn out one way, but if they turn out in a different way than expected, they tell us nothing, right? So if I believe Taxol is the greatest thing for renal cancer, and I made up something as the reason, and I do a phase 2 trial of Taxol in renal cancer, and if I see a bunch of responses, I'm a genius and it'll be great. If, as expected, nothing happens, I've learned nothing. I've absolutely learned zero. And that's in some ways one of the biggest mistakes, I think, in clinical trials. So in some ways, expect your experiment to work differently than you thought it would, and make sure that as you collect the data, that's going to help you understand why it failed, right? And that sort of is a big thing about sort of failure. The other thing about rejection and failure is, as I said, best of luck, 10-15% of grants get accepted. most papers will get rejected, especially if you try to submit them to a high impact journal. They're going to come back. It ain't personal. This is not your personal value. Your kids, your spouse, your loved ones, your mom, they're still going to love you, right? Even if you get rejected. And, sometimes when you get these rejections, almost always there is a kernel of truth in it, and you just have to sort of take that and sort of say, what is it in these comments and criticisms that makes sense? And that sometimes takes 24, 48 hours because, you've just spent, 3 years of your life doing something, and then someone comes back and says, you're an idiot, right? Your first response is, what are you talking about? You get angry, right? Calm down, go back to it 24, 48 hours later after you've calmed down, and then read it and sort of say, okay, what did they really mean? Despite that, you're gonna run into some review or somebody that truly is an idiot. And, despite your best efforts, they just didn't read it. We've all written grants where, you got a bunch of criticisms, you rewrote the grant, you answered all the criticism, and someone comes back and says, well, I didn't like it because of X, Y, and Z. And like, well, that's not what I got criticism the first time around. It's the nature of the business, right? And I tell everyone that this is a marathon and not a sprint, right? You're going, rejection, failure, lack of, that's all part of what we do. And I think that, when I sometimes, especially as I've gotten older, when people see, when trainees see people like Brian or me, they sort of say, oh my God, everything that you've touched has worked, how do you get there? And I expect to do the same thing. And I'll turn around and show you the 35 negative phase 2 trials I did in kidney cancer, long before any of the VEGFR inhibitors hit.
Well, you once told me you built a career on negative phase 2 trials.
I developed an entire career on negative phase 2 trials.
Yeah, I agree with those thoughts. I mean, it's the long arc of doing it, and in some ways, in the clinical realm, there is a little bit of, I think just to back up, one thing that I find people, especially like right out of fellowship, don't appreciate is how long it takes.
Oh yeah.
Right. It takes a long time. You sort of expect, man, in a couple of years, I'm going to have multiple first author papers and IITs going, and then all of a sudden, 2-3 years later, you got, a fraction of that. And it's not that they're doing anything wrong. I chair a mentoring committee within Vanderbilt, and that we get that comment a lot from people at that stage. Like they feel like, gosh, I'm really not doing enough. I'm behind. And they're not. They're doing wonderfully. It just hasn't, like, there's this, you got to kind of get over the hump. And then suddenly this hits and a grant hits and a paper hits and you get an oral presentation, whatever, whatever the output is. And then it sort of picks up from there. But that first trek, from, in my case, end of fellowship to that first big hit, it can be, and it was accelerated for me because of the timing of VEGF therapy being developed. So it was just dumb luck. I was a little younger enough than Walt that I missed some of those negative phase 2s, although I wrote some of them up, but missed some of them. So that's on here somewhere, the role of luck. I mean, there's a huge role of luck here, right? It tends to come to people who work harder and are prepared, of course, but there's a big element of, I got lucky that Walt and Nick were there when I went to University of Chicago, right? And I got lucky that Sutent was developed down the street from UCSF where I was. So those were just, relatively random lucky things. So it's a big part of success, I think.
Yeah, it's a huge part. But what the reason I put it down here is that everybody gets lucky sometime in their career. Sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later, but not everybody recognizes it when luck is, in front of them. And so then this gets back to what you said in terms of, yes, I got to be focused, but I have to have enough balls in the air so that I, can recognize the luck when it strikes me and then pursue that. And, my personal story was, I'd been writing all these negative phase 2 trials for renal cancer forever. And we had a phase 1 trial with this drug called sorafenib. It was supposed to be a RAF inhibitor, and they're putting colon cancer patients on it, and nothing happened. But because I had nothing available for patients, I just put them on the, I put them on this trial. And we had responses. And, the first time we had a response, I said, what the heck is this, right? And then we went another way, and we had another response. And I remember to this day that, Mark Retain, who was another one of my mentors, stormed into my office, and, he does storm into people's offices, and says, Walt, those responses that you're seeing on this drug, the people at Penn and MD Anderson are also seeing responses in kidney cancer patients. How many kidney cancer patients do you have? I'm like, for something that might work, how many do you want, right? And so I literally took all of my kidney cancer patients, instead of putting them on my own trial, put them on this phase 1 trial, where I wasn't even the PI. And, within a year, I was, the world's expert on sorafenib and VEGFR inhibitors, just because that happened to be, what happened at that time. And it was dumb luck. But I could have just as easily said, well, I got a lot of other trials. I got my own trials. I got to put the patients on there. I got to complete those. But, I recognize that this was an unusual observation that was completely unexpected, and I couldn't just ignore it, or I shouldn't just ignore it.
So we just have a few minutes left. I was going to maybe, instead of diving into another topic, Walt, just ask you to finish with like if you were giving a young Walt Stadler advice 30 years ago, about here's the 3 things absolutely do, or the 3 principles, however you want to phrase it, and the 3 things to avoid. I thought it might be a good way to sort of summarize. I will say before you answer, we'd like to, for the other folks on the call, for the mentees, I mean, we'd like to do more of this career stuff. This is a topic in a didactic, but I think for the presentations for annual meeting, I think this is valuable. You tell me if you find it valuable, but so any way we can do this or think about how to formalize it, I'm open to, just to plant a seed to start thinking about it. But go ahead, Walt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the keys have always been to be enthusiastic, humble in terms of what you know and don't know, and willing to explore new avenues, and willing to do some willing to explore and do different things. I think that the things that I've done in the past that didn't work so well is trying to pursue and work with mentors that clearly did not have, my own interest in my work in their heart, so to speak. And I spent a lot of time pursuing, some translational research in a group of patients, mainly sort of localized bladder cancer, that weren't patients that I saw, that I needed to, completely depend on the urologist to work with. And I learned something. I got to know a lot of urologists in the process, but since I wasn't seeing the patients, a lot of this wasn't necessarily directly in my, in my control and my purview. And, I was always the, the second person on the dance card, so to speak. And, it took me a while to recognize that I was the second person on the dance card and I needed to move on, so.
Great. Any final questions or comments from the group? This has been really good. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, sharing your wisdom with us. When you were telling that story about the paper charts, but made me feel old. Like literally, there's like 8 pounds of, maybe 80 pounds of charts to go through. It's just a pain in the butt. All right. Thanks. Well, thanks again. We appreciate you. Thanks to everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.